So we're picking up today with relations between capital and labor. And our first topic is going to be that new class of factory owners. So industrial development intensified long-standing problems between capital and labor in both the cottage industry and in urban workshops. And the growth of new occupational groups in industry led to this new mindset about social relationships. And that was this: that individuals were members of an economically determined class that had conflicting interests with everyone else. Early industrialists operated in a very highly competitive economic system, waging a constant battle to cut production costs and to stay afloat while pouring most of the profit back into the business for better machinery. And so cutting costs or cutting production costs means low wages, pretty much. Artisans and skilled workers who had really exceptional ability had really good opportunities during this time. Although, as factories and firms grew larger, many of these opportunities began to decline, and it became considerably harder for a gifted yet poor young mechanic to start a small business. Formal education for sons and for males in general became more important as a means of success and advancement. Wives and daughters of successful businessmen also found fewer opportunities in regards to active participation in Europe's business world. And as far as middle class women were concerned, they considered working in an office or a factory as undignified work. And so middle class women concentrated instead on their proper role as a wife and a mother. The new factory workers. So Britain was the first country to industrialize, so they seemed to suffer the harshest social consequences of the Industrial Revolution. A poet named William Blake was one of the first people to criticize the process of industrialization, and he actually called the early factories satanic mills and worked hard to protest against the hard life of the London poor. And William Wordsworth, kind of in the same vein, lamented the destruction of the rural way of life. Where are all the fields and the agriculture and the good old days, which there were still fields and agriculture. It just didn't require as many people to work the fields. But Wordsworth was saddened by the droves of people who were leaving farming to go work in industry. In northern England, there was a group of people called the Luddites, and I'll spell that for you. They were opposed to industrialization, and they showed it by smashing new machinery, which they believed were putting them and other handicraft workers out of work. Doctors and reformers wrote about the problems in the factories and the new towns, and then of course we talked in the last video about Malthus and Ricardo, who said workers were making nothing, and they were really only making enough money to stay alive. Another critic of the Industrial Revolution was Frederick Engels, and he published The Condition of the Working Class in England, which was a blistering indictment of the middle class. And according to him, the culprit of all of this was industrial capitalism, with its nonstop competition and its constant technical change. So early on in the Industrial Revolution, as you can tell just by the critics of the revolution, working class wages and living conditions were pretty much atrocious. Only after 1820 and especially after 1840 did wages rise substantially, so that the average worker could earn and consume about 50% more in real terms by 1850 than they did in 1770. And historians believe that to a large extent, it's not that they were earning more, but it was because they were working more. 300 days per year by 1830 with 11-hour work days. So generally speaking, So generally speaking, as the Industrial Revolution progressed, workers were earning more wages, even if it was because they were working more hours, but they were also eating more food and more healthy food, food that had higher nutritional quality. Per capita use of specific goods supports the position that the standard of living for these people rose, at least moderately, after the wars with France were over. And again, that's because they were buying more. So obviously they had more money to spend if they were buying more goods. Work in the early factories. So cottage workers who were used to the putting out system and not the kind of life and discipline demanded by the factories were reluctant to work in these new factories, even when they were offered good wages, just because the putting out system or the cottage industry and the factory system were so different. Cottage workers' reluctance to work in these factories prompted the early cotton mill owners to turn to abandoned poor children for their labor. And these children were often very poorly treated, terribly overworked in the mills, as they were when they were apprenticed as chimney sweeps or market girls and shoemakers. So this wasn't really new with the factory system. This had been going on. Interestingly, though, the semi-forced child labor system seemed necessary and was totally socially acceptable for the time. And from our modern viewpoint, of course, it looks like, it was cruel exploitation, and it kind of ruins the whole industrial system a little bit. But during the time, it was completely acceptable. Working families and children. So by the 1790s, the use of these little children in the factories was in decline, and by 1802, it was actually forbidden by Parliament. Many more textile factories were being built, mostly in large urban areas where they could use steam power instead of water power, and where they could attract workers more easily, because these poor, unskilled workers tended to gravitate toward the cities. And so as they took on new jobs, working people didn't just give in and accept the highly disciplined system of labor. Many times they instead helped to reform the system or modify the system by bringing some of their familiar traditions. And in the same way that many of these people had worked on the farms and in the putting out system, workers often came to the mills and the mines as family units. So the mill or the mine owner would bargain with the head of the family and pay him for the work of the whole family. And so the preservation of the family as an economic unit in the factories from the 1790s on made these new surroundings, the whole Industrial Revolution, more tolerable. And adult workers really weren't that interested in limiting the minimum working age or the hours of their children as long as they were together as a family. Only when there were changes in place that threatened to put control and discipline in the hands of a manager did adults protest conditions on behalf of their children. Some enlightened employers and social reformers in Parliament argued that even after all that, that more humane standards were necessary. Robert Owen, who was a successful Scottish manufacturer, testified in 1816 that employing children under 10 years of age as factory workers was, quote, injurious to the children and not beneficial to the proprietors. And so in 1833, the Factory Act was passed that limited the factory workday for children ages 9 to 13 to 8 hours, and that of adolescents ages 14 to 18 to 12 hours. And so children under 9 began to be enrolled in elementary schools that were actually established by the factory owners. And the employment of children declined especially rapidly after that. And this kind of broke the pattern, though, of whole families working together. The sexual division of labor. In pre-industrial Europe, some jobs were traditionally defined by gender. Women and girls were usually milking the cows or spinning, and men and boys were either plowing or weaving. But many of the tasks might go to either males or females. By the 1830s, though, this was beginning to change, and a different sexual division of labor was evolving. So by 1850, there was a new pattern of separate spheres. And this meant that the man worked as the family's primary wage earner, and the woman was expected to concentrate on housework, on raising the children, and some type of craft work at home to keep her busy. When married women did work for wages outside the home, they usually came from the poorest families where either the husbands were poorly paid, or they were sick or unemployed, or in some cases just missing. So legions of young unmarried women worked full-time, but only in certain jobs like the textile factory or laundering or in domestic service, like as a family servant or something like that. All women were generally confined to low-paying, dead-end jobs, and men were the primary wage earners, so they predominated in the better-paying, more promising jobs. Some believe that this organization of paid work along gender lines was due to this attitude of patriarchal tradition, which had predated the economic transformation, and others just see it as a combination of economic and biological factors as a better explanation of the emergence of a sex-segregated division of labor, i.e. the machines are heavy, women cannot operate them, so men did. That would be looking at it in a biological light, rather than they were trying to keep this whole patriarchal tradition thing going. Relentless factory discipline conflicted with childcare in a way that labor on the farm or in the cottage had not. So running a household in these conditions of primitive urban poverty was extremely demanding, and trying to shop and feed the family was pretty much a never-ending challenge. And I don't know that women during this time may have felt extremely slighted by the fact that they weren't making as much as their husbands, or it's possible that they were so busy working that they didn't really have time to think about who was getting paid more, or who was being unfairly treated because they weren't given promotions at work. At any rate, the Mines Act of 1842 did prohibit underground work for all women and girls, as well as for boys under 10, which that was a good thing, because many of the women who were down in the mines were taken advantage of. The early labor movement in Britain. I think we get the idea with the Industrial Revolution that the majority of people were working in these subpar conditions in a factory somewhere. But in 1850, more British people still worked on farms than in any other occupation. And industrial work wasn't even second. Domestic service was the second largest occupation, with more than 1 million household servants, and 90% of those of whom were women. So many old, familiar jobs outside of industry did provide alternatives for individual workers and work to help ease the transition to industrial civilization. And even within industry itself, it did not completely kill off artisans working with hand tools in small shops. And in many trades, that remained unchanged. There were still skilled artisans that had a shop downtown and either worked alone or had 1 or 2 apprentices. Working class solidarity and class consciousness developed in small workshops just like they did in large factories. modern technology and factory organization had created this mentality of the few versus the many, with the few being the owners, the rich, the managers who controlled the conditions of the many workers. And that wasn't specific just to the factories, but that was true within artisan workshops as well. The British government came out against monopolies and guilds and workers' unions. Sometimes in Great Britain they're called combinations, but unions are just a collection of people that are fighting for better working conditions, fewer hours, higher pay, things like that. So in 1799, Parliament passed the Combination Act, and that outlawed unions and strikes. But that only lasted for 5 years because Parliament repealed the Combination Acts in 1824, and from that point on, unions were tolerated. So the next stage in the development of this British trade union movement was the attempt to build a large single national union of all workers who were fighting for better conditions and pay. And so social reformers like Robert Owen eventually succeeded in organizing one of the largest and most visionary of the early national unions, and it was called the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union. And this whole British labor movement moved in the direction of craft unions, and the most famous of those was the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, which represented skilled machinists. And these unions were really successful. They won benefits for members using fairly conservative means, and because they went about this in a conservative manner and weren't trying to spark riots and upheaval, they became an accepted part of the industrial scene. British workers also engaged in direct political activity in defense of their interests, including involvement in the Chartist movement, which just saw a political democracy. So working people developed a sense of their own identity and played an active role in shaping this new industrial system.